In the winter of 1910, there is a private island off the coast of Georgia where the richest men in the world go to disappear. It is called Jekyll Island. The club that owns it is so exclusive that a single membership costs a fortune, and the roster reads like a directory of the American aristocracy: the Morgans, the Vanderbilts, the Pulitzers, the Goulds. It is said that the members of this one club control a sixth of the wealth of the entire planet, and in November of that year, its doors are closed. The season has not begun. The great cottages sit empty, the servants dismissed, the grounds silent. The perfect place, in other words, to hold a meeting that must never appear in any record, in any newspaper, in any history book. Picture the scene. It is the night of November 22nd, 1910, at a railway station in Hoboken, New Jersey. A private railroad car sits waiting at the far end of the platform, its curtains drawn, its lamps dimmed. A United States Senator, one of the most powerful men in the country, arrives, ostensibly leaving on a duck hunting expedition. One by one, the other men board. They have been given instructions that sound absurd for grown men of enormous stature. Arrive separately. Do not arrive together. Tell no one where you are going. And when you are on board, use only your first names. Do not, under any circumstances, use your last names in front of the porters, the stewards, or the railroad staff. Because if a single one of them recognizes a single one of you and mentions it to a single reporter, the entire enterprise is finished before it has begun. Two of the men take the secrecy even further. A senior partner at J.P. Morgan and the president of one of the largest banks in New York decide that first names are not enough, so they invent new ones. They begin calling each other Wilbur and Orville after the Wright brothers as a private joke on the theory. One of them later wrote that they were always right. Think about that for a moment. These are not spies, these are not fugitives. These are the architects of the American economy, the men whose signatures move markets, and they are traveling in disguise under aliases to a deserted island in the dark so that no one will ever know they were in the same room together. And here's the part that should stop you cold. It works. For 25 years, it works. For a quarter of a century, not one of these men publicly admits that the meeting ever took place. The institution they go on to create becomes one of the most powerful entities on Earth, an entity that touches the price of your bread, the rate on your mortgage, the value of every dollar in your pocket. And for a generation, the men who wrote its founding blueprint keep the origin story locked in silence. Now, you have heard of the Federal Reserve. You know it as a dry, bureaucratic institution, a building in Washington, a man on television talking about interest rates. The version in the textbooks tells you it was born out of sober debate, careful legislation, the ordinary machinery of a functioning democracy. And that version is not exactly false, but it leaves out the most important chapter. It leaves out the island. It leaves out the disguises. It leaves out the fact that the blueprint for America's central bank was written not in a committee room in the Capitol, but in a shuttered clubhouse in the dark by 6 men who swore each other to secrecy. So how did the most consequential financial institution in modern history begin its life as a conspiracy? And who exactly did it serve? The version in the textbooks leaves out the most important chapter. Here's the full story. To understand Jekyll Island, you first have to understand a single, uncomfortable truth that runs underneath the entire story. The engine of this history was not politics. It was not ideology. It was not even the public good, whatever the official record may say. The engine was money, who controls it, who creates it, and who stands to profit when the rules of money are rewritten. And that engine was deliberately hidden from you because the men who built this system understood a principle that every powerful institution has always understood, that power exercised in secret is far more durable than power exercised in the open. If the American people had known in real time that a handful of Wall Street's most powerful bankers were personally drafting the law that would govern the nation's money, the plan would have been dead on arrival. So the plan had to be laundered, passed through the hands of respectable senators and reform-minded congressmen until its origins were invisible. This is the story of how that laundering was done. And it begins, as these stories so often do, with a panic. Here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. In October of 1907, the American financial system very nearly collapses. It begins with a failed scheme to corner the stock of a copper company, but it spreads with terrifying speed, the way fear always does. Depositors line up outside the great trust companies of New York, demanding their money back all at once. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest in the city, is forced to suspend operations. Panic ripples outward. Banks call in loans, credit freezes, the stock market plunges, and there is no central authority, no institution of any kind with the power or the mandate to step in and stop the bleeding. And so one man steps in instead. His name is J.P. Morgan. He is an elderly banker with a famously ferocious glare, and in the autumn of 1907, he effectively becomes a one-man central bank for the United States of America. From his private library on Madison Avenue, Morgan summons the heads of the major banks and trust companies. He locks them in a room. He organizes a syndicate to pool their resources and inject liquidity into the failing institutions, deciding personally which firms will be saved and which will be allowed to die. It works. The panic is contained. But the lesson that the financial establishment draws from those weeks is not one of gratitude, it is one of terror. Because they have just watched the entire American economy be rescued by the willpower of a single 70-year-old man, and everyone in that room understands that J.P. Morgan will not live forever. The system, they conclude, cannot survive on the mortality of one banker. It needs what it does not have, an elastic currency that can expand in a crisis and a permanent lender of last resort. It needs, in a word, a central bank. This is the critical detail that changes everything, because the men who wanted a central bank could not simply ask for one. America had a deep, almost religious suspicion of centralized financial power, dating back to Andrew Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States. To propose a central bank openly, in the language of Wall Street, was political suicide. So the reform had to wear a disguise of its own. In 1908, in direct response to the panic, Congress passes the Aldrich Plan Act, signed on May 30th of that year. Buried inside it is the creation of something called the National Monetary Commission, a body tasked with studying the nation's banking system and recommending reforms. And the man appointed to chair it is Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, Republican of Rhode Island. Now remember that name because Nelson Aldrich is the thread that ties this entire story together. He is one of the most powerful men in the Senate, so influential that he is nicknamed the general manager of the nation. He is also, and this is not incidental, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. His daughter married into the Rockefeller fortune, which means that the man appointed to reform American banking is bound by marriage to one of the 2 or 3 largest concentrations of wealth on the planet. Aldrich spends the better part of 2 years touring Europe, studying the central banks of England and France and Germany, and by the autumn of 1910 he is ready to write the blueprint, but he cannot write it in Washington. He cannot write it in public. He cannot even be seen with the men whose expertise he needs, and so he plans a secret expedition. Here is where the threads converge. The men Aldrich gathers on that private railroad car are not random. Each one is chosen for a specific reason, and together they represent an astonishing concentration of financial power. There is Aldrich himself, the senator, the chairman, the political muscle. There is Abram Piatt Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, who provides the government's technical knowledge. There is Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, representing the House of Morgan directly. There is Frank A. Vanderlip, the president of the National City Bank of New York, the bank that would one day become Citibank, one of the largest financial institutions in the country. There is Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's personal secretary, to handle the drafting. And there is the man whom many historians consider the true intellectual architect of the entire scheme, Paul M. Warburg, a partner at the investment house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Warburg deserves a moment of his own because without him there is arguably no Federal Reserve at all. He is German-born, from Hamburg, the son of a wealthy banking family with deep roots in European finance. He immigrates to the United States in 1902, and he arrives with something almost no American banker of the era possesses: an intimate, working knowledge of how the great central banks of Europe actually function. He has spent years thinking about the architecture of money, about reserves, about discount rates, about how a currency can be made to expand and contract with the needs of commerce. To the other men in that railroad car, Warburg is the expert. He is the one who can translate their fears into a functioning system. Some accounts, including Frank Vanderlip's own memoir, also place a 7th man at the meeting, Benjamin Strong, of Bankers Trust. And remember his name too, because it will matter enormously later. For roughly a week, these men are marooned together on Jekyll Island. They work in near total isolation in a clubhouse emptied of staff, hammering out the details of a plan to remake the American monetary system. And the secrecy is not paranoia, it is strategy. Frank Vanderlip understood exactly what they were doing, and decades later he described it in words that are almost startling in their frankness. Writing in the Saturday Evening Post on February 9, 1935, 25 years after the fact, Vanderlip confessed, "Despite my views about the value to society of greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator." He is not being accused of conspiracy by an enemy. He is calling himself a conspirator, in print, with something close to pride. And on the aliases, he wrote, "Davison and I adopted even deeper disguises, abandoning our own first names. On the theory that we were always right, he became Wilbur and I became Orville." Most remarkably of all, Vanderlip did not hedge about what the meeting produced. "I do not feel it is any exaggeration," he wrote, "to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. The actual conception." That is the phrase from a man who was in the room. And here is where the story takes its next turn, because the document they draft on that island does not simply become law. What emerges from Jekyll Island is a proposal for something called a National Reserve Association, a central body. In Aldrich's preferred version, a single powerful central institution with branches that would hold reserves, issue currency, and act as the lender of last resort that 1907 had proven the country so desperately needed. This proposal becomes known as the Aldrich Plan, and when Aldrich brings it back to Washington and attaches his name to it, he makes a fatal political error. Because his name is the problem. This is the detail that changes the entire trajectory of the story. By 1911 and 1912, the American political landscape is dominated by the progressive movement, a broad revolt against exactly the kind of concentrated corporate and financial power that Nelson Aldrich represents. To the progressives, Aldrich is not a reformer. He is the living embodiment of what they call the money trust, the shadowy alliance of Wall Street banks, led by the House of Morgan, that they believe has captured the American economy. And now here is Aldrich, son-in-law to the Rockefellers, general manager of the nation, proposing a plan to centralize control of the entire monetary system. The optics could not be worse. The 1912 Democratic Party platform explicitly opposes the Aldrich Plan by name, condemning it as a surrender to the very money trust the public has come to fear. The plan is politically radioactive. It never passes. It never even comes close. And this is the twist that the crude version of the story always gets wrong. The bankers' plan failed. The document written in secret on Jekyll Island by the very men who stood to benefit from it was rejected, killed by the same populist suspicion of Wall Street that had made the secrecy necessary in the first place. If the story ended there, it would be a tale of powerful men who overreached and lost. But it does not end there, because a plan can die while its ideas live on. And here is where the laundering I mentioned earlier truly begins. Now, here's where the threads converge for the final time. With Woodrow Wilson's election in 1912 and the Democrats in control, the task of banking reform passes to two men with impeccable anti-Wall Street credentials, Representative Carter Glass of Virginia and Senator Robert Owen of Oklahoma. Glass in particular is a fierce critic of the money power, exactly the kind of man the public trusts to keep the bankers in check. Glass and Owen take up the cause of reform, and they produce their own bill, the Glass-Owen Bill. On its surface, it is the opposite of the Aldrich Plan. Where Aldrich wanted a single central institution, Glass and Owen restructure the system around 12 regional Federal Reserve banks spread across the country with a governing board appointed by the government in Washington. It is decentralized. It has public oversight. It is, in its packaging, a progressive reform, a rebuke to the money trust, not a gift to it. And on December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signs the Federal Reserve Act into law. But here's the question that has haunted this story for more than a century. How different, really, was the finished institution from the blueprint drawn up in secret on Jekyll Island? And the most damning testimony comes not from a critic, but from one of the architects himself. Paul Warburg, the intellectual father of the whole scheme, later went through the final Federal Reserve Act and pointed out, in detail, the numerous similarities and the matching wording between the Aldrich Plan and the law that actually passed. The core architecture, a system of reserve-holding banks, an elastic currency, a lender of last resort was, in its essential bones, the Jekyll Island design. Woodrow Wilson himself reportedly considered the Aldrich Plan to have been roughly 60 to 70% correct. 60 to 70%. The historian Milton Friedman noted the strong continuity between what the bankers drafted and what the country got. The plan, written by the money trust, was rejected, and then its skeleton was dressed in progressive clothing, given a decentralized structure and a public board, renamed after its populist sponsors, and passed into law by the very movement that had sworn to destroy it. Carter Glass spent the rest of his life furiously denying that he had copied the bankers' work. When the accusation was put to him in the Senate in 1922, he called it, and I quote, "No greater misconception was ever projected in this Senate chamber." He insisted the Federal Reserve was his creation, a genuine reform, not a repackaged gift to Wall Street. And in fairness to Glass, the differences were real. We will come back to that. But the essential irony stands. The men who wrote the first draft got most of what they wanted, and they got it precisely because their names were scrubbed from the final product. And what became of the men from the island? Consider just one of them. Benjamin Strong, the seventh man, the one from Bankers Trust, went on to become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In the 1920s, that position was the single most powerful post in the entire Federal Reserve System, more powerful in practice than the board in Washington. The man who sat in a secret meeting to design the system ended up running its most important institution. Paul Warburg, the architect, was appointed to serve on the very first Federal Reserve Board. The blueprint's authors did not merely see their design become law. Several of them ended up sitting at the controls of the machine they had drawn. So how did the world finally learn the truth? For years, there were only rumors. The first public crack in the wall of silence came in 1916, when a financial journalist named B.C. Forbes, who would go on to found Forbes magazine the following year, published an account of the Jekyll Island meeting in Leslie's Weekly. The piece was largely admiring, a portrait of clever, patriotic men solving a national problem, and the details almost certainly came from Paul Warburg himself, who comes off as the hero of the tale. Then, in 1935, came Frank Vanderlip's remarkable confession in the Saturday Evening Post, the memoir I quoted earlier, in which a man who had been in the room called himself a conspirator and called the island the site of the system's actual conception. Piece by piece, over the course of decades, the men who had traveled in disguise finally admitted where they had gone and what they had done there. Now, I want to be very careful here, because this is a topic where conspiracy theories flourish, and where the truth is quite unsettling enough without embellishment. So let me draw the line as sharply as I can between what the documented record shows and what the popular myth has layered on top of it. Everything I have told you about the meeting itself is not conspiracy theory. It is established history, confirmed by the Federal Reserve's own historians, by Roger Lowenstein's definitive 2015 narrative History, America's Bank, and by Elmus Wicker's standard academic account of the origins of the Fed. The secret meeting genuinely happened in November 1910 at the Jekyll Island Club. The men really did travel under a duck-hunting cover story. They really did use first names only, and two of them really did call each other Wilbur and Orville. They really did keep it secret for roughly 25 years. They were real, and they were among the most powerful bankers and officials of their era. They really did draft the Aldrich Plan there. And that plan, repackaged, really did become the backbone of the Federal Reserve Act. This is all true. The banking historian Roger Lowenstein put it about as bluntly as a serious scholar can. You gotta hand it to the conspiracy theorists, because, in fact, there was a conspiracy. I call it a patriotic conspiracy. A conspiracy, but a patriotic one in his reading, aimed at a real and pressing national problem. But here's where the honest version parts ways with the lurid one. There is a famous claim that the men in that room controlled 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Treat that figure with great caution. It is a popularizer's estimate, traceable to B.C. Forbes and amplified in G. Edward Griffin's conspiracy book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. A 1931 New York Times obituary put the Morgan-connected Jekyll members at roughly 1/6 of the world's wealth, and the 1/4 figure only appears when you speculatively add in the Rockefellers and various European financiers who were not actually in the room. It is a claim, not a measured fact. And Griffin's book itself, though it is the pop conspiracy Bible on this subject, has been debunked by economists and historians. The economist Edward Flaherty called Griffin's account amateurish and highly suspect, and the legal scholar Peter Conti Brown of the Wharton School recommends reading it for entertainment but not information. Worse, that strain of literature has a habit of fixating on Paul Warburg's Jewish and European banking connections, drifting into ugly anti-Semitic tropes. Let me be unambiguous. The villain in this story is not any ethnicity, and it never was. The villain is an institution and a logic, the logic of concentrated financial power operating in secret. Warburg's crime, if it was one, was being a banker who wanted a central bank. Nothing more. And there is one more myth to puncture, the biggest one of all. The idea that a cabal simply seized control of America's money on that island, or that a private cartel secretly owns the dollar. The record says otherwise. Remember, the bankers' plan was rejected by Congress precisely because lawmakers judged it gave the bankers too much power. The institution that actually passed was deliberately restructured into 12 regional banks under a mix of public and private governance, with a board appointed by the president. The finished Federal Reserve differed substantially from what the men on the island drew up. The honest line is this: a small group of the era's most powerful financial men really did secretly write the first blueprint. But Congress reshaped it, and the sensational claims about world wealth percentages and secret ownership are estimates and embellishments layered on afterward. The truth is quieter and somehow more disturbing for being true. So what is the real lesson of Jekyll Island? It is not that a handful of men own your money in some cartoonish cloak and dagger sense. The real lesson is more subtle and far harder to dismiss. It is that the most important decisions about how a nation is governed, decisions that shape the value of your labor, the cost of your home, the security of your savings, are not always made in the places you are taught to look. They are not always made in the sunlit chamber of the legislature under the eye of the voter and the press. Sometimes they are made in the dark, on a private island, by men who understand that the surest way to win a public argument is to make sure the public never knows the argument is happening at all. The genius of Jekyll Island was never really the plan. The genius was the disguise, the recognition that a good idea from the wrong messenger must be given a new face and a new name before the people will accept it. And that technique did not die in 1913. because we are all still living with the consequences. The Federal Reserve that those men conceived is not some historical curiosity. It is the institution that sets the interest rates governing your mortgage, your credit card, your student loan. When it raises rates, millions of people quietly lose their homes or their jobs. When it lowers them, the price of everything you own can rise or fall. It is, by design, insulated from the direct will of the voter, independent, in the language of its defenders, unaccountable, in the language of its critics. And the deepest question raised by that island is one we have never really answered as a society. Who should control the creation of money? And to whom should they answer? The men on Jekyll Island gave one answer, in secret, and we have been living inside their answer for more than a century. Whether that was a patriotic act of foresight or a quiet surrender of democratic control is, in the end, not a question of history. It is a question of judgment, and it is still open. So here's what I want to know from you. Roger Lowenstein called what happened on that island a patriotic conspiracy. A conspiracy that was real, but aimed at a genuine problem. Do you buy that? Was Jekyll Island a group of clear-eyed men saving the country from its own financial fragility? Or was it the moment a democracy quietly handed the keys to its own money over to the people least accountable to it? Drop a duck emoji in the comments, so I know you made it to the end of the expedition. And if this is the kind of deep dive you come here for, the story behind the story, the chapter the textbooks leave out, subscribe. It genuinely makes a bigger difference than you might think, and it keeps this kind of work coming. I'll see you in the next one.